Hi, short revision of Caroline Duffy's Head of English. This is going to seem a little bit ironic because I am a Head of English and I'm also going to be guilty of many of the things that Caroline Duffy is satirising in the poem. If we take a look at it, its form is that of a dramatic monologue. And one of the things that we see is this voice of the Head of English comes across revealing their characteristics in a very clear manner. So through that use of the dramatic monologue, Duffy's satirising the Head of English. We hear their prejudices, we hear their approach to teaching, and we can form judgments about them on the basis of their own language use. It's also worth recognising that it's written in regular sestets, so each stanza is 6 lines long, and that regularity might be significant as well in terms of the fact that we have a clear sense of order, structure, discipline being imposed on the poem, and it's the same kind of structure, discipline and order that's being imposed on these students. They are forced to conform and have certain views without having the independence and freedom to think for themselves. If we have a look at the first stanza, today we have a poet in the class, a real live poet. And it's the use of those 2 adjectives to modify poet that makes it seem a little bit patronising. It almost sounds like the kind of language a child would use. Notice the ink-stained fingers. The verb notice as an imperative verb, that order, that command, shows the authority of the Head of English. And it's something that we see repeated throughout the poem. It's the first of many imperative verbs. Then we get the instruction, please show your appreciation by clapping. Not too loud. And the not too loud that follows, please show your appreciation by clapping, shows again that stamp of authority. This is a moment when the children are supposed to show their appreciation for a guest speaker, and yet they're being controlled and limited in their response. This enjambment's interesting. Enjambment's used a couple of times to interesting effect in the poem. Now, and then we get the break to the next stanza. It creates a kind of staccato rhythm that we also see in some of the holophrastic sentences. Again, that kind of punchiness that reflects the nature of this particular character. But now, sit up straight and listen. The fact that the enjambment's used allows the second stanza to begin with an imperative verb. So again, the authority. Second sentence begins with remember, again an imperative verb. Here we've got some of those holophrastic sentences, still. And then short sentences like, never mind. Again, that kind of staccato rhythm, that abruptness that's characteristic of the Head of English. This is an interesting adverb to employ, sadly. Not all poems, sadly, rhyme these days. There's a sense of the conventional. The Head of English expects poems to rhyme. He expects them to have a certain order and structure and conform to certain quite old-fashioned ideals. You get a sense of that old-fashioned approach as well in the lesson on assonance. Particular poetic techniques are being taught in isolation rather than in the context of the poet and appreciation of the poet's craft. Whisperings, as always, out of bounds. Out of bounds normally refers to a kind of geographical area, isn't it? Like you don't go on the playground, you don't go out onto the tennis courts. Here, it's being referred to a verb, whisperings out of bounds. So in a sense, it's a transferred epithet. There's an awkwardness and a wrongness to it, but there's that, again, sense of order and control that's dominating here. But do feel free to raise some questions. After all, we're paying £40. It's the cost that's important for the Head of English, not the benefit that might be acquired from listening to a poet speak. So the kind of artistic merit is thrown out. It's also worth noticing within the context of this comment on rhyme that Duffy herself does use irregular rhyme to help satirise what the poet expects, what the poetic voice expects good poetry to be. Those of you with English second language, see me after break. There's a sense in which students with English as a second language won't be able to access poetry. They're denied access to it. And that in itself is really bigoted and links to the Kipling reference that we get at the end of this stanza. We're fortunate to have this person in our midst. Midst isn't the kind of word that we would tend to use nowadays. It's fairly archaic. Archaic as in old-fashioned, just as the poetic voice is, the Head of English. Seasons of Mists and so on and so forth. And I think that Seasons of Mists is particularly interesting given that it's a reference to Keats's season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, he can't remember the rest of the quotation. So it exposes both his ignorance and also his pretensions to be quoting Keats in this manner. We see that carried on in, I've written quite a bit of poetry myself, that self-aggrandizing approach. I'm doing Kipling with the lower fourth. Kipling is a poet who's renowned for their clear use of rhyme, so it appeals to the head of English, and also they have a fairly imperialistic bent to their poetry. So the idea of English as a second language being excluded would be something that a Kipling lover might find appealing. Right, that's enough of me. On with the Muse. Now, this might be a particularly ironic reference to describe the poet that's coming in as the Muse, because the Muse could be referring to Calliope, the Greek muse for poetry. Now, I would regard that as ironic because, generally, poetry that was assigned to the Muse was structured in a very established, very traditional way. It conformed to certain expectations of epic poetry. And so, again, that's what the head of English is expecting. Things to be traditional, things to be ordered, things to be structured. Open a window at the back. We don't want winds of change about the place. Now, on one level, we have the fact that he's asking for a window to be opened, presumably because someone's broken wind, and get rid of the smell. But it's also a reference to the phrase used by Harold Macmillan in 1960 with regard to the conflict in the Congo, where there was a striving for independence. Notice they don't want winds of change, don't want independence, don't want free thought. And there's the suggestion that while listening to the poet, the students should take notes, but don't write reams, just an essay on the poet's themes, just an essay. This is work that's going to be done for work's sake, rather than something that will allow students to gain a love of poetry or an interest in it. Between the penultimate and final stanza, we get the sense that the poet has delivered their contribution, but we don't get any access to it. It's conspicuously absent. All we still get is the poetic voice recounting their thoughts and feelings both before and after. And the first thing we get is, well, really? These holophrastic sentences indicating the shock of the head of English at what they've just heard. Clearly this hasn't been a conventional reading. Clearly this hasn't been the established traditional form that was expected. Run along now, girls. I'm sure that gave an insight to an outside view. The head of English damns the poet's perspective as being unconventional, as being something that's an outsider's perspective. Ironic, perhaps, given that the head of English's perspective is perhaps the one that we would now regard as being unconventional, hopefully, and certainly the outsider's view. Applause will do. Thank you very much for coming here today. Notice the way the enjambment works here. We talked about enjambment before. Thank you very much for coming here today. It's quite ambiguous as to who this thank you is being applied to. Initially here we have applause will do directed at the students, and then thank you might indicate that thanks are being offered for the applause. However, the enjambment suggests that it's actually a thank you for the poet's attendance. The ambiguity kind of undermines the value of the gratitude that's being expressed. It's faint praise. And finally we get these series of comments that are directed at the poet. Lunch in the hall, do hang about. Unfortunately I have to dash, Tracy will show you out. It's all very dismissive, very disrespectful. There's no care for the guest speaker, and there's that kind of arrogance that's suggested by it, and dismissal of someone who's an artist that the poet really dislikes and is trying to reject over the course of the poem. Okay, thank you.